The Lie That Made Elizabeth Báthory a Monster. Let me tell you something strange about history. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not born from truth, but from whispers, from a single story told by the wrong person at the wrong time, from a lie that someone decided to write down, and then someone else decided to believe, and then everyone decided to repeat until the lie became heavier than any fact could ever hope to be. Elizabeth Báthory is dead now. She has been dead for more than 400 years. But the thing she is famous for, the thing that made her name echo through centuries of horror stories and vampire legends and dark fairy tales, that thing might never have happened at all, or at least not in the way you have been told. Let us go back, not to her castle, not yet. Let us go back to the beginning of the lie itself, because that is where the truth starts to look very different from the legend. The woman before the monster. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary. The Bathory name meant something in those days. It meant land, it meant armies, it meant kings and cardinals, and the kind of wealth that ordinary people could not even imagine. Her uncle was Stephen Bathory, the Prince of Transylvania, and later, King of Poland. Her family had ruled Transylvania for generations. They had fought Ottomans, they had built castles, they had married into the most important royal houses in Europe. She was not born into darkness, she was born into power. When she was 11 years old, her family betrothed her to Ferenc Nadasdy, another powerful nobleman from another powerful family. The Nadasdy name carried almost as much weight as the Bathory name. The marriage was not about love, of course. It was about land and alliances and the endless chess game of European aristocracy. But, by all accounts that survive, the marriage was not unhappy either. Ferenc Nadasdy was a soldier. He spent most of his time fighting the Ottomans on Hungary's southern border. They called him the Black Knight of Hungary, not because he was evil, but because he wore black armor into battle. He was away from home for long stretches, sometimes years at a time, and, during those absences, Elizabeth managed their estates. She handled the business of running a vast noble household, collecting rents, settling disputes, managing servants, and keeping the machinery of their wealth turning smoothly. This was not unusual. Noble women in 16th century Hungary often managed estates while their husbands were at war. It was expected, even respected. Elizabeth Báthory was known to be intelligent, educated, and capable. She spoke several languages. She read Latin and Greek. She corresponded with learned men across Europe. She was, by any measure, an extraordinary woman for her time. She was also, by most accounts, a mother. She and Ferenc had several children who survived to adulthood. There is no evidence that she was cruel to her children. There is no evidence that she was cruel to anyone, not yet, not in the early years. The records we have from this period show a busy, wealthy, powerful noblewoman living a life that was largely unremarkable for someone of her station. So, where did the monster come from? The husband dies. In 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy died. He had been sick for a while, probably from wounds and illnesses picked up during decades of warfare. Elizabeth was 44 years old. She was now a widow with enormous wealth, enormous land holdings, and enormous responsibility. She was also, under Hungarian law, largely independent in a way that few women of her era could claim. But independence came with problems. The Nadasdy estates were vast, but they were also heavily indebted. Ferenc had spent enormous sums on his military campaigns. He had borrowed money from relatives, from banks, from other noble families. Elizabeth inherited not just the land but the debts, and in 16th century Hungary, debts of that magnitude could destroy even the most powerful families. She needed to protect her children's inheritance. She needed to keep the estates intact. She needed to manage creditors who were becoming impatient. And she needed to do all of this alone, as a woman, in a world that did not always trust women to manage large affairs. This is important. Remember this, because the debts would matter later. The whispers begin. After Ferencz's death, something changed. We do not know exactly what, because the historical record becomes murky and contested. But we do know that by 1609, rumors were circulating about Elizabeth Báthory. Not the blood-bathing rumors yet, not the vampire rumors. Those would come later, but rumors about cruelty toward servants, about beatings, about young women disappearing from her castles. We need to be careful here. Servants in 16th century Hungary had almost no rights. Beatings were common. Cruelty was common. The legal system did not protect servants the way it protected nobles. A noblewoman who beat her maidservant might be considered harsh, even unusually harsh, but she would not be considered a monster. She would be considered a noblewoman exercising her authority. So the early rumors, even if they were true, would not have made Elizabeth Báthory unique. They would have made her typical, or at least not exceptional. But something made the rumors spread. Something made people listen. Something made the accusations grow from beatings to torture, from torture to murder, from murder to mass murder on a scale that defied belief. That something was politics. The king's debt king, Matthias II of Hungary, needed money. This is not unusual. Kings always need money. But Matthias needed money badly because he was fighting wars and consolidating power and trying to keep the Ottoman Empire from swallowing his kingdom whole. And one of the wealthiest estates in Hungary, the Nadasti estates, was controlled by a widow who owed enormous sums to the crown. Here's the thing about debts in 16th century Hungary. If a noble family owed money to the king, and if that noble family could be disgraced or destroyed, the king might seize their lands and cancel their debts. It was a convenient way to solve financial problems. All you needed was a good enough reason to move against the family. Elizabeth Báthory gave the king a reason, or rather, the king's men found a reason, or invented a reason, or exaggerated a reason, until it became a weapon they could use. In 1610, King Matthias ordered György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate the rumors about Elizabeth Báthory. Thurzó was a powerful nobleman in his own right, and he had his own reasons to want Elizabeth brought down. She owed money to him as well, large sums that would be difficult to collect from a living, powerful, well-connected widow. What happened next is the heart of the lie, the investigation. Thurzó did not conduct a modern investigation. He did not gather physical evidence. He did not perform autopsies, or examine crime scenes, or interview witnesses under conditions that we would recognize as fair. He did what powerful men did in the 17th century. He arrested servants, he questioned them under torture, and he wrote down whatever they said. Torture is important here. When you torture someone, they will tell you whatever you want to hear. They will confess to anything. They will name any accomplice, describe any crime, invent any horror, because the pain is unbearable, and the only way to stop it is to give the torturer what he wants. The servants who were arrested and tortured gave confessions. They said that Elizabeth Báthory had beaten servants to death. They said she had burned them with hot irons. They said she had covered them in honey and left them tied up outside to be eaten by insects. They said she had bitten flesh from their bodies. They said she had tortured and killed hundreds of young women. And then, under further torture, they said that she had bathed in the blood of virgins to maintain her youth. That last detail is important. The blood bath, the thing that made Elizabeth Báthory a vampire legend instead of just another cruel noblewoman. That detail came from tortured servants, probably fed the story by their torturers, probably desperate to say anything that might make the pain stop. There is no contemporary evidence for the bloodbath outside of these tortured confessions. None. No witness account written before the investigation. No diary entry from a horrified visitor. No letter from a concerned relative. Nothing. The bloodbath appears only in the confessions extracted under torture, and then in the later retellings of those confessions. The trial that was not a trial. Elizabeth Báthory was never tried for her crimes. This is a strange fact that most versions of the story leave out. She was arrested, yes, and confined to her castle, and her servants were tried and executed. But Elizabeth herself was never brought before a judge, never given a chance to defend herself, never confronted with her accusers. Instead, Thurzo and his men went to her castle in December 1610. They said they found a dead girl in the castle. They said they found other girls imprisoned and tortured. They said they found evidence of terrible crimes. And on the basis of this evidence, which we only have through Thurzo's own reports, they arrested Elizabeth and bricked her into a set of rooms in her own castle. She would spend the last 4 years of her life in that confinement. She would die in 1614, still imprisoned, still untried, still never given the chance to speak in her own defense. Meanwhile, her servants were put on trial. Some were tortured. Some were executed. Their confessions, extracted under torture, became the official record of Elizabeth Báthory's crimes. And those confessions said she had killed more than 600 young women. 600. Think about that number. If Elizabeth Báthory had really killed 600 young women over the course of her life, she would have had to kill one woman every 2 weeks for 25 years. She would have had to dispose of 60 bodies for every year of her adult life. She would have had to maintain a steady supply of victims traveling to her remote castle, disappearing without anyone noticing, without any family coming to look for them, without any official investigation. It is absurd. It is mathematically impossible. But the number stuck because the number was shocking, and shocking numbers make good stories. The political convenience. Let us talk about what happened after Elizabeth Báthory was imprisoned. The king seized her lands. Her debts to the crown were cancelled. Her debts to Thurzo were cancelled. Her children were forced to give up large portions of their inheritance to pay legal fees and fines. The whole affair was remarkably convenient for everyone who had been owed money by the Bathory Nadasdy estates. Do you see the pattern here? A wealthy widow with powerful enemies and enormous debts is accused of impossible crimes based on confessions extracted under torture. She is never tried. Her lands are seized. Her debts are erased. And the accusations against her grow more fantastic with every retelling until she becomes a legend, a monster, a vampire. This is not a unique story. History is full of powerful people destroyed by convenient accusations. The difference is that most of those accusations faded over time, while Elizabeth Báthory's accusations grew. The first lie becomes the second lie. After Elizabeth died, the story did not die with her. It spread, first through Hungary, then through the rest of Europe. The details became more elaborate with each retelling. The bloodbath, which appeared only in the tortured confessions, became the central image of the story. People who had never met Elizabeth Báthory, who had never seen her castle, who had never read the trial records, began to tell the story of the Blood Countess, who killed virgins and bathed in their blood. By the 18th century, the story had become a sensation. Writers and scholars repeated it as fact. They added their own details. They claimed Elizabeth had kept a diary of her murders, a diary that no one has ever produced. They claimed she had been born with signs of evil on her body, a detail that appears in no contemporary source. They claimed she had been taught dark arts by a servant, another detail that appears only in later retellings. By the 19th century, the story had become entangled with the emerging genre of vampire literature. Bram Stoker read about Elizabeth Báthory while researching Dracula. He borrowed details from her story for his Count, the vampire who drank blood to maintain his youth. The connection between Elizabeth Báthory and vampires, a connection that has no basis in any contemporary source, became fixed in the popular imagination. By the 20th century, Elizabeth Báthory was a horror icon. Movies were made about her. Books were written about her. Heavy metal bands wrote songs about her. She appeared in video games and comic books and Halloween costumes. The Blood Countess had become a monster, a symbol of pure evil, a figure of nightmares. And all of it, or almost all of it, was built on a lie, what the records actually say. Let me tell you what the actual historical records show. Not the sensational retellings, not the vampire legends, not the Hollywood movies. The actual documents from the 17th century. The investigation records from 1610 to 1611 mention 4 named victims. 4, not 600. 4 young women whose deaths were attributed to Elizabeth Báthory. There are references to other unnamed victims, but the total number mentioned in the official records is much closer to a few dozen than to 600. The records also show that Elizabeth Báthory was accused of cruelty, not of vampirism. The bloodbath appears in the servant confessions, but it is not mentioned in the official charges against her. It was a detail, a lurid detail, but not the main accusation. The main accusation was that she had beaten and tortured servants to death, which was terrible, but not unprecedented for a noblewoman of her era. The records also show that the witnesses against Elizabeth were her own servants, many of whom had reasons to lie. Servants in noble households often had conflicts with their employers. They also knew that accusing their employer of terrible crimes might earn them leniency, or favor with the investigators, or even reward. In a system where torture was standard practice, confessions were not reliable evidence. The records also show that Elizabeth Báthory maintained her innocence until her death. She never confessed. She never apologized. She wrote letters to her children from her imprisonment insisting that she had been wrongly accused. Whether you believe her depends on whether you believe confessions extracted under torture are more reliable than the word of a woman who was never convicted of anything. The alternative explanation. Here is an alternative explanation for the Elizabeth Báthory story. It is not romantic. It does not involve vampires or bloodbaths or dark rituals, but it fits the evidence better than the legend does. Elizabeth Báthory was a wealthy widow with enormous debts. She was also a woman in a society that did not fully trust women with power. She had enemies who wanted her land and her money. King Matthias needed to seize her estates to pay his debts. Georgi Thurzo needed to collect what she owed him. The other noble families of Hungary had reasons to want the Nadasti lands broken up and distributed. So they manufactured a scandal. They arrested her servants, tortured them until they confessed to terrible crimes, and used those confessions to justify imprisoning Elizabeth without a trial. They exaggerated the number of victims to make the scandal too big to ignore. They added lurid details like the bloodbath to make the story unforgettable. And then they seized everything she owned. The servants who were not executed were probably grateful just to be alive. The king was grateful to have his debts erased. Thurzo was grateful to collect what he was owed, and Elizabeth Báthory, the inconvenient widow, was locked away until she died. It is not a satisfying story. It does not have a clear villain, unless you count the king and the Palatine and the whole corrupt system of 17th century Hungarian justice. It does not have a clear hero, unless you count a dead woman who never got to defend herself. But it has something that the legend lacks. It has the weight of evidence why the lie survives. The lie about Elizabeth Báthory survives because it is useful. It is useful to horror writers who need a real historical figure to base their monsters on. It is useful to filmmakers who need a shocking story to draw audiences. It is useful to historians who want to talk about female evil without talking about the systems that create and punish that evil. But mostly, the lie survives because people want to believe it. We want to believe that there are monsters in the world, real monsters, not just ordinary people driven by ordinary greed and ordinary cruelty. We want to believe that somewhere, in a dark castle in a foreign land, a beautiful countess bathed in the blood of virgins to stay young forever. That story is exciting. That story is terrifying. That story is so much more interesting than the truth. The truth is that Elizabeth Báthory was probably a harsh employer, maybe even a cruel one, in an era when cruelty toward servants was common and unremarkable. The truth is that she was a wealthy woman with powerful enemies and crushing debts. The truth is that she was destroyed not because she was a monster, but because destroying her was convenient for powerful men. That is not a good horror story. It is just history, and history is full of people who were called monsters because someone found it useful to call them monsters. The legacy of the lie. Elizabeth Báthory has been dead for more than 400 years. She cannot defend herself. She cannot correct the record. She cannot tell us what really happened in those castles on the Hungarian plains. All she has are the documents that survived. And those documents tell a story that is more complicated, more ambiguous, and more human than the legend allows. The lie about the bloodbath has become so entrenched in popular culture that most people do not even know it is a lie. They repeat it as fact. They write books based on it. They make movies that assume it is true. The lie has become true in the only way that matters for stories. It has become the version of events that everyone knows. But knowing that it is a lie changes things. It changes how we think about Elizabeth Báthory. It changes how we think about the history of Hungary. It changes how we think about the stories we tell about evil women, about powerful women, about women who are destroyed for reasons that have nothing to do with justice. Maybe Elizabeth Báthory was guilty of something. Maybe she did beat her servants. Maybe she did torture young women. Maybe the confessions, even the tortured confessions, contained some kernel of truth. We will never know for certain. The evidence is too corrupt, too compromised, too tangled in the politics of the 17th century to ever yield a clear answer. But we can know one thing for certain. The bloodbath is a lie. The vampire countess is a fiction. The monster that horror writers have created over the past 400 years is not Elizabeth Báthory. It is a story about Elizabeth Báthory, a story that has been told and retold and embellished and exaggerated until the real woman has disappeared entirely behind the legend. The real horror. Here is the real horror of the Elizabeth Báthory story. It is not the horror of a murderous countess bathing in the blood of virgins. That horror is fake, invented, a fantasy for people who enjoy being scared by impossible things. The real horror is the horror of a woman who was destroyed by a lie. The horror of a legal system that did not require proof or trial or even basic fairness. The horror of a world where a wealthy widow could be locked away forever because powerful men wanted her land. The horror of stories that outlive the truth and that become heavier than the truth, that turn a human being into a monster for the entertainment of strangers 400 years in the future. That horror is real. It happens every day, in every country, in every legal system where power protects power, and the powerless suffer for the convenience of the powerful. Elizabeth Báthory was not a monster. She was a victim, not of her own cruelty, but of a system that found it useful to call her cruel. The lie that made Elizabeth Báthory a monster is still alive. It is in the books you read, the movies you watch, the stories you tell your friends around campfires. It is everywhere because it is a good story, and good stories are hard to kill. But now you know it is a lie. Now you know where it came from. Now you know who told it and why, and what they gained by telling it. And knowing that, you get to choose. Do you keep telling the lie, or do you tell a different story? A harder story, a truer story about power and greed, and the invention of evil. Elizabeth Báthory is dead. She cannot answer for herself. But history is not dead. History is still being written, still being argued, still being shaped by the stories we choose to tell and the stories we choose to leave behind. The lie that made her a monster does not have to be the last word. The truth, even the uncertain truth, even the complicated truth, even the truth that is less exciting than the legend, is still worth telling. And maybe, just maybe, telling the truth about Elizabeth Báthory can help us see the lies that are making monsters out of women right now, today, in our own time, because the same patterns still exist, the same convenient accusations, the same destruction of inconvenient women, the same stories that grow and twist and become legends while the truth waits, patient and ignored, for someone to finally tell it. Do not let the lie win. Do not let Elizabeth Báthory be remembered only as a monster. Remember her as a woman, a widow, a mother, a noble, a debtor, a victim. Remember her as someone who lived and died in a world that was not fair, a world that destroyed people for profit, a world that told stories to hide the truth. Remember her, and remember that the monsters we create are often just people we have decided not to understand.